Back with Enemy at the Gates here at Stalingrad, part of the Operation Combat series by the gamers, and it is the end of turn 2, start of turn 3. Just going to recap a couple of things. I mean, the Germans haven't done much apart from try and close the door into Stalingrad. You know, they're scrabbling around trying to create an effective sort of fortress, essentially, because instead of having to just defend on the front, they have to defend you know, a circular perimeter. So they're pulling in, trying to do that. They've got about 78 factors or something in this area. I've just done the count up. They're allowed to use low movement factor artillery, essentially the horses, pulling slow artillery units as supply. So they've that seemed like a good thing to do early. Cut the number of steps actually that they're trying to support, and use those to supply the rest. They've got more than enough artillery in here to fire. I mean, they haven't got the supply to fire, but you can see DG'd Russian stacks. There's I think that's a tank corps up there that got hit, and there's some couple of infantry divisions in there that got hit, and so on. You know, they fired a few artillery shots out just to keep the most dangerous looking threats DG'd. Outside the pocket, the Germans have picked this city here, Milerovo, as their sort of new point of operations. Essentially, they had a nice 17th Panzer Division, very powerful Panzer Division with a lot of units in it, arrive as reinforcements, railed it into this place, Milerovo, with plenty of supply, and that is essentially their base. You can see they've blocked off the roads with a couple of units there, and so I'm using that as the kind of fallback point. It's got this river in front of it, which I mispronounced horribly last time. Kalitva, the river Kalitva. So that is where I've sort of chosen for the Germans to try and base themselves. If they can hold on to these more forward areas, then they will be happy. If they can't, then, well, they've got their sort of base of operations at least decided. They could do with an HQ down there, to be honest, although they have got one out along the road here. So that's what the Germans are doing. And just to point out as well that this 4th tank will have to pull back, or it costs the Russians victory points each turn. There's quite a lot of scripting around the creation of the Stalingrad pocket, and there are sort of mandated German units that have to stay within the fortress zone, essentially. About 5 divisions that can't leave, or it costs the German player victory points. But equally, there are 5 or 6 corps, Russian corps, that once the Germans declare the fortress, have to stay within this red garrison zone, or it costs the Russians victory points, and that 4th Tank Corps is one of them. Luckily for the Russians, neither of these are. The 1st Guard Mechanised and 1st Tank are free to operate outside this zone, but this 4th Tank is going to have to pull back, or it starts costing a VP a turn. It only means pulling back to here, because you can see the red dotted line, but it does mean that it's not free to go pressing an attack down this sort of rail and road line, which would have been nice for the Russians. They'll have to find some other troops to try and do that. There's other rules as well that mean that as the pocket gets properly formed, and there you have to exercise some judgment here, but as the Germans establish a defensive line, the Russians are obliged to maintain pressure on it with at least 3 steps in each hex surrounding it. In other words, they have to properly jam the Germans in and lock them in. And that's going to take a lot of troops. I'm not sure where those are coming from either at the moment. Maybe some of this very slow infantry up here, once it's finally done with mopping up the last of the Romanians has to come down in this direction and form that sort of outer barrier. So there are things going on in these early turns that are quite scripted, that force both sides to take certain courses of action, and you have to try and manage that. So that's a little bit of a headache to deal with logistically. In the meantime, the Germans are also, as I say, trying to establish their new base of operations back up around here and try and get some semblance of stability into this mid sort of region between Milerovo and Stalingrad. You can also see the Italians formed something of a line here because the Russians were threatening to cut in behind them with another pontoon, and with this area under Russian control and no supply into this area for the Romanians, this section in here was starting to look extremely dangerous. With these rivers, it was very difficult to get truck supply through there, and there were a bunch of Italians threatening to get encircled purely by this little breakout here. So they've pulled back into to try and form a line from the Don to this road, and will probably fall back more in this direction and establish a better perimeter in front of Milerovo when they've got the opportunity. So this is what's happening in the more fluid section of the map, and meanwhile the pincers sort of slowly the noose is being tightened around Stalingrad. End of turn 3 here, enemy at the gates. Quite a quiet turn by Stalingrad standards. The Germans have pulled back into a very sort of coherent shape now here, with the perimeter well defended in around Stalingrad. This is, what they've kind of got the units for. The rules allow them to use, as I think I said before, convert slow artillery units and wagon points into supply points for the purposes of feeding these troops. So they've got probably 4 turns worth of wagon points in here before they even have to start using supply, and they've probably got 10 supply in here, so they've probably got 8 turns of supply if they're just left alone, which would take them to the turn 11, turn 12 before they even start struggling. That puts them, let's have a think, if I pull out the turn chart, turn 11, turn 12, so that puts them around 27th to 30th of December, so the turn of the year probably before they actually run out of supply, provided they don't have to use any supply for combat. And so obviously the Russians can start pulling supply away from them by making attacks and forcing them to use combat supply. That said, the Germans, if we get any weather where they can fly, have got transports around that can try and ferry supply points in. So we'll see how this is going to work out. The German Axis forces are attempting to create something of a new perimeter. I mean, they are slowly finding some shape and some form. They've established, some defences there with some artillery in behind to DG the most dangerous attackers. They have got now a Panzer battalion in there with an HQ with plenty of supply. Actually, I've put some of that supply in the wrong place, and I just need to change that. But with plenty of supply, they got another Panzer division come on, 27 Panzer come on as reinforcements this turn. It's pretty weak, but again, it can sit and hold a position and establish something of a defensive line for them. And then they're scrabbling around trying to make this area work with some defence. This is another sort of Panzer division that's split up between these stacks, trying to hold this area around Morozovsk. So they're doing what they can to start trying re-establishing some sense of some stability. I mean, when this breakthrough first happens, you look at the German position and there's just wasteland back here with nothing in it, and nowhere to fall back to. Nowhere looks any more worthwhile than anywhere else. You've got no troops, no supply, and no fallback position. It's really nasty. But with some reinforcements come on, they're establishing some sense of control again, at least in some of these areas. So that's been the sort of German task, is to re-establish some infrastructure and some command and some supply and a defended position. They've kind of done that. They're kind of getting there, and they've definitely done it in Stalingrad, where they've established a robust defence. I think. I mean, no doubt there are some weak hexes in here, but I don't really know where they are. So it's potluck for the Russians if they want to throw an attack in, whether they end up hitting something weak or something really, really unpleasant. So we're about to go into turn 4. This is where we start seeing, rolling for initiative normally. So, yeah. And also there's sort of variable German reinforcements that could have come on this turn, didn't, but could come on and start rolling on from this southern edge over here. So, lots happening. Just starting up turn 4 then here at enemy at the gates, and the Germans have won initiative quite handily. A couple of things that might make this a very interesting turn. Firstly, flight is allowed for the first time in the game, so that's going to allow the German fighters to get to grips with the Russian Air Force. It's going to allow the Germans to attempt to fly in some supply with their transports into Stalingrad, and it's also going to give their dive bombers wherever they've got to, their Ju-87s and things, some targets. So that's going to be very interesting to see how it pans out, because the Russians really haven't got their air in a position to intercept, so they could take a bit of a pasting from air attacks here. And the other thing is that the German reinforcements this turn, there's a really very tasty Panzer division coming on there. The 11 Panzer. 11 Panzer coming on there, and a couple of big infantry divisions and another transport. So having won initiative and being able to get some airstrikes in first might really favour the Germans here. So yeah, interesting to see how this one pans out. End of turn 4 at enemy at the gates then. Quite a quiet turn by the standards so far. Giving you a sort of low shot of Stalingrad here with the forces off into the distance. What becomes kind of interesting in this game, is becoming interesting very rapidly, is that OCS has a lot of logistical. It has an underlying logistical game, and then it has the military game on top. And so this pattern of roads and railways and trucks and convoys and HQs determine where you can get to and where you can't, where you can supply into and where you can't, and that becomes more and more of a puzzle as you sort of expand. So we've had the situation where the Russians have started over here, and you can see an area here that's cleared entirely of Axis forces, because as the Russians expanded into it, it was impossible to maintain any sort of supply network or any defence of that supply network. So now the Germans are rebuilding further back here, and they've got a bases established there, and a line of battalions up over here, and then a further base back there, and further bases back there. And so they're re-establishing this kind of supply net and logistical network that is required to maintain any sort of coherent front and any sort of defence or offence. The Russians are rebuilding slowly into a position where they can launch another offensive. But it takes time and it takes effort, and it's difficult to do while, it becomes a bit makeshift. You're moving stuff around because it's there, not necessarily because it's the right tool for the job. And you end up in some tricky situations. Down over here, I've ended up with the supply network built in such a way that it's frankly rubbish, and I need to rebuild it. But moving, for example, these extenders somewhere far more sensible, while not cutting everything out of supply that's relying on those extenders, becomes a real challenge. So yeah, you have to pay a lot of attention to the sort of underlying supply network that you're relying on to attack and to advance, and So the Russians, however, have got an HQ as far forward as this, and there is a truck sort of extender underneath there, and they're advancing down this road here and having a look down in this direction where there's absolutely nothing as far as the eye can see until you get all the way over there. So if they could strike down into this area, they'd be quite happy, because theoretically they could cut this rail line in behind these Romanians. They could drop into that railway and behind these Romanians and cut the entirety of this Romanian, the rest of these forces, what's left of them, the retreating Romanians, completely out of supply. So there's stuff like that going on, as well as the sort of scrapping and fighting and military. Planes got to fly this turn, so the Germans were able to drop a couple of Ts of supply via their transports into Stalingrad. The Russians ate it up with some... Actually, the Russians were on a hot streak of flak rolls. They got a flak roll because it was landing in a patrol zone, so they got a flak roll against the aircraft operation that went into Stalingrad and shot some of the transports down, even though it had fighter escorts. Their fighters got aborted, but their flak did the job. The Germans sent their Stukas in over here to try and keep this attack quiet. It's now, because the Russian turn just ended, they've got their DGs removed, but that stack with the 736 armour on it, that was DG'd, but they shot down some Stuka dive bombers, some Ju-87s, and then the Russian Air Force came in and repaid the favour with some IL-2s DGing both of those stacks. So some tit-for-tat exchanges. The Russians also flew some air missions into Stalingrad and DG'd some German stacks in Stalingrad, as you can see. And then attacked, actually, they attacked across the river into this DG'd stack here with 24 factors across the river. It was halved, but they were only, that stack, the DG'd stack only had like 5 factors in, and the Germans got to reinforce that pretty swiftly. But anyway, so the Russians ended up with something like a 4-1 attack, got surprised, rolled a 2. The roll was something dreadful as well, like a 2 or 3. They took 2 losses, and they had 2 full strength. They had 2 full strength infantry divisions essentially demolished by a breakdown regiment, which was not their finest moment. However, over here they did attack into this DG'd stack. You can see they've retreated, so because they took an option. They had to retreat, but they did cause 2 casualties in there, because it was lost 1, option 1, and the Germans didn't want to take the option to retreat, because then that was opening up too many nice spaces on this side of the river for the Russians to get a foothold into sort of attacking. So they stuck it out, took the loss on the infantry division, which still will defend at full factors. Coming into turn 5 then, it suddenly becomes a little bit important who wins the initiative. Not massively, but it's interesting. You know, there's a definite advantage to winning the initiative right now. Just the Russians would like to try and get some momentum going back down here and maybe take advantage of those 2 DG stacks in the Italians to press down the river. They'd like another shot at attacking into Stalingrad to soak some more supply out of it, and so on. So yeah, we'll see what happens. In fact, we won't see what happens. We will come over here, pick up the dice, throw them in the dice pot. The red dice are the Russians, of course. So it's a 7 to an 11. The Germans have won that comprehensively and are going to take the initiative. Coming into turn 6, then start of turn 6, enemy at the gates. Germans have just won the initiative and have chosen to go first, but a bit of a recap on where we are at the end of turn 5 here. As you can see, Stalingrad is now a very solid mass of troops. The Germans have managed to airlift some supply in the past, but there's no flight again this turn, so that's staying put. But they're nowhere near running out of supply yet. Despite Russian attempts to chip away, they're managing to eat wagon points and so on to stay in supply. They've got a fair number of those left, I think, even before they start on their supply points. They're not doing much attacking out of here, but they don't have to. The Germans have established a reasonably good sort of solid defence in this region. What they are lacking is a headquarters down here, desperately in need of a headquarters down here, and one of my priorities actually is to rail in that 24th Panzer 10-0 HQ back down, sorry about the zooming and the back down into this area, so that they've got an HQ down here, because they've got more than, they've got the headquarters to spread. You know, they've got Hungarian 6-0 headquarters, 6-0 headquarters, 6-0 headquarters. They've got 4 headquarters in that area and nothing to supply this area, so these guys are having to sort of direct draw from rail lines and detrainable hexes and stuff, and it's not good. It's not flexible, and it doesn't allow them to move and take up the positions that they'd like. They've got one 6-0 Romanian HQ there, but the main headquarters is further back. The one that's sort of coordinating is back there, that 10-0 in Milarova. So, but they have established a position here. Now the Russians are massing for an attack against this Italian line. You can see they've already chipped away at the edge, DG to stack, made some ground up the Don River, and are threatening, obviously massing forces here ready to go in. But the Germans, the Axis, have now got an opportunity to kind of react to that, and one of the things they've got is a Panzer division kind of not dug in, but at least sensibly positioned here and able to strike back up this road to threaten the supply if this makes too much progress and leaves the sort of lines of communication undefended. But in response to that, the Russians have got an HQ. They've got an extender in there, an HQ ready to come down into this area, and this 4th Mechanised Corps ready to roam into this region and potentially cut into the rail line back here, and could potentially cut all this lot out of trace. So the Russians are developing a new threat down into this totally undefended area down here. And right now the Germans just haven't had the resources to, you know, they're being spread very thin, just trying to create defensive situations up in here and something of a backstop position. Having said that, they do have a Panzer division that I initially placed down in Rostov as a when things were completely falling apart. I just tried to create, I thought I'd create positions further back for the Germans to fall back towards, and then ease their defensive positions forwards, rather than set them too far forward and find them constantly being leapfrogged and cut out of supply. So they do have a Panzer division back in Rostov which can challenge for control of this area, and it needs to do something, because the other thing is that the Russians have dropped an armoured brigade, sorry, it's not a brigade, it's an armoured division, tank division, down onto this rail line, and that is cutting this lot out of trace. They've also broken through here. The remains of this area are a pretty sorry sight, and the Russians have carved them up, and still have probably adequate defence against these Germans here, who by special rule aren't really allowed to leave that area, or if they do, they unlock a whole huge new set of Russian forces, so it's in their interest to stay put for the time being. The Germans have variable reinforcements that can come on this south edge, essentially returning from the Caucasus campaign and drive on the oil fields and returning back into this sort of 200-mile stretch of southern Russia, but they only appear on a 10 plus on 2d6 in the reinforcement phase, and so from turns 3 to 19, well, we've had turns 3, 4 and 5 and nothing's appeared as yet. There's potentially 4 divisions that could come on through here, and they're tasty troops as well. They're not troops that the Germans can really afford to be without, but they're not rolling well enough to get those. Since we're in, what have I just done? I've done first turn determination, aircraft refit. I don't think the Germans have any aircraft to refit, so let's make a roll for the Germans on camera now, just to see whether they've got anything arriving. So 10 plus for some variable reinforcements. There's a 7 for them, so no, nothing there. And they've been rolling equally poorly, it has to be said, on their variable replacements tables, and supply has been pretty bad for them as well. Oops, I've just scattered German forces everywhere. That's not very good. There's 1.5 T and a Panzer division in there. So I'm just sorting this out down here. But their rolls on the variable tables have been really poor. They've had something like 2 personnel, no equipment. You know, this is in 5 turns of rolling on this table. They've had, they get nothing on a 2 to 6 and only 1 personnel on a 7 to 9. So chances are they get the odd bit of personnel, but so far in 5 rolls they've had 2 packs, and that's it. And their supply situation is improving, but they're not rolling well on this supply table either. Anyway, let's give them some rolls on that as well, see how they do. So on the variable reinforcements, they've got a 5, that's nothing. And on the supply table, they've got a 7, which is 14 supply, and that gets multiplied by, that gets cut by a quarter. We're in the move to OCS 4.1 or whatever, so 14 comes down to, what's that, 3.5, 10.5, I make it. So they'll get 10.5 supply come in this turn. And yeah, any other, and then we have to check the tables to see if they've got anything in turn 6 in the scenario book. So let's see what I'm digging around for Axis reinforcements. Okay, a Luftwaffe division 1222, a railroad battalion, a couple of Heinkels, an ME-109 and a transport plane. Okay, so some an infantry division, some aircraft, railroad, 2 railroad battalions. Okay, I'm going to fish those around and get on with the German turn then.